Bangladesh's parliament has allowed 23 out of 133 post-uprising reform ordinances to lapse or be repealed within weeks of taking office. And that single number captures a deeper shift that is still unfolding. What appears to be a procedural legislative review is in fact a test of whether the political momentum created after the 2024 uprising will translate into lasting institutional change. The global stakes are not abstract, because Bangladesh sits at the intersection of South Asian stability, labor supply chains, and democratic governance trends. What this video examines is how a reform agenda backed by roughly 70% of voters in a referendum is now being filtered through parliamentary power, and what that means for the direction of the state. If this process consolidates into a stable legal framework, Bangladesh could transition from protest-driven change to institutional continuity. If it fragments, it risks returning to a system where accountability mechanisms remain weak. And if it escalates politically, it could shift the balance between elected authority and street-level mobilization. The outcome determines whether reforms become embedded structures or remain temporary responses to crisis. The roots of this moment go back to July 2024, when a student-led uprising forced the resignation of longtime Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina after years of criticism over governance practices, restrictions on dissent, and allegations of enforced disappearances. That uprising was not a single event, but a sustained movement that led to more than 200 reported deaths in demonstrations and triggered a collapse of the existing political order. In the immediate aftermath, an interim administration led by Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus took control, tasked with stabilizing the country and preparing a reform blueprint. This blueprint became the July National Charter, a framework endorsed by more than 24 political parties and later approved through a nationwide referendum held alongside the February 2026 elections. Approximately 70% of voters supported it, giving it both political and public legitimacy. The charter focused on judicial independence, human rights protections, decentralization of power, and reforms to policing and anti-corruption systems. However, because Parliament had been dissolved after Hasina's exit, the Yunus administration relied on ordinances rather than full legislative acts to implement these ideas. Under Bangladesh's constitutional rules, these ordinances required approval by the next elected parliament within 30 days of its first session. That parliament, dominated by the Bangladesh Nationalist Party under Prime Minister Tarique Rahman, convened in March 2026 after a decisive electoral victory. Lawmakers reviewed all 133 ordinances issued during the interim period. Official figures show that 110 were approved, some with amendments, while 23 did not survive the process. Of those, 7 were formally repealed and 16 expired without a vote. The specific ordinances that were removed are central to the controversy. They include reforms related to the National Human Rights Commission, judicial appointments, Supreme Court administration, policing, anti-corruption oversight, and the legal definition of enforced disappearances. These areas are not peripheral. They directly affect how state power is monitored and constrained. For example, the 2025 Ordinance on the National Human Rights Commission expanded its authority to independently investigate allegations against security forces and introduced clearer timelines and accountability mechanisms. Its repeal reinstates a 2009 framework that limits the Commission's ability to directly investigate such cases, requiring it instead to rely on government reports. The issue of enforced disappearances illustrates the legal gap created by this shift. During the previous administration, a government commission received more than 1,900 complaints and verified at least 1,569 cases, including individuals classified as missing or dead. The ordinance introduced under the interim government defined enforced disappearance as a standalone criminal offense, establishing procedures for investigation and prosecution. With its lapse, existing laws do not clearly define the crime, and the International Crimes Tribunal can only address such cases if they form part of a broader systematic pattern. This creates a structural limitation where individual cases may not meet the threshold for prosecution. Judicial reform is another critical area. The interim proposals included creating an independent Supreme Court Secretariat and a council-based system for judicial appointments, aimed at reducing executive influence. With these ordinances no longer in effect, the existing system remains largely unchanged, maintaining a degree of executive involvement in judicial processes. Analysts note that this affects the balance of power between branches of government and the practical independence of the judiciary. The government's position, articulated by Home Minister Salahuddin Ahmed, frames these developments as part of a legislative review rather than a rollback. The argument is that reviewing 133 ordinances within a limited time frame requires prioritization, and that some laws need further consultation to avoid inconsistencies across legal frameworks. The government has indicated that revised versions of key laws, including those on human rights and enforced disappearances, may be reintroduced after broader stakeholder engagement beginning in mid-May. Opposition figures and civil society groups interpret the same sequence differently. Leaders such as Actor Hossain argue that reducing a structural reform agenda to standard parliamentary procedures risks diluting its intent. Outside Parliament, figures like Shafiqur Rahman have signaled the possibility of sustained protest movements, indicating that the political contest is not confined to legislative chambers. Two potential scenarios illustrate the trajectory ahead. In the first, the government follows through on its stated plan to reintroduce revised legislation after consultation. If these laws retain core accountability mechanisms while addressing technical concerns, the reform process could regain momentum and align parliamentary authority with the earlier referendum mandate. This would represent a transition from interim governance to a more stable institutional framework. In the second scenario, delays or substantive changes weaken the original intent of the reforms. If key provisions related to oversight, judicial independence, and human rights are not restored, the system may revert to pre-2024 patterns where executive power faces fewer constraints. This could lead to increased political polarization, more frequent protests, and reduced confidence in formal institutions. The geopolitical implications are tied to Bangladesh's role in the region. As a country of more than 170 million people with significant participation in global manufacturing supply chains, its internal stability affects broader economic networks. Governance indicators also influence foreign investment, development partnerships, and diplomatic engagement. What to watch next are concrete legislative steps rather than political statements. The timeline for reintroducing key laws, the content of revised proposals, and the scale of public response will provide measurable indicators of direction. The interaction between parliamentary decisions and street-level mobilization will also shape the pace and scope of change.